It started like any other traffic stop. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark asphalt, a routine sight on the side of an empty road. But what happened next? No one, not even the officer himself, could have predicted. The man behind the wheel had his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded. Not out of guilt, but out of fear. Fear of what this stop could mean for him, for his son sleeping in the back seat, for the life he was barely holding together. Officer Daniel stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he walked toward the vehicle. Another night, another driver to pull over. He had no idea that this moment would be one he would never forget. "License and registration," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The driver, a man in his mid-30s, looked up. His eyes were tired, heavy, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Slowly, he reached into his glove compartment, his fingers trembling slightly as he handed over the documents. Daniels glanced at the license. Aaron Mitchell. A name like any other. But something felt off. The car was old, its paint chipped, the dashboard worn down from years of use. The little boy in the back was wrapped in a blanket, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, completely unaware of the tension filling the car. Aaron swallowed hard. "Officer, Daniels held up a hand. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Aaron exhaled sharply, staring straight ahead. He could lie. He could make up some excuse. But what was the point? He knew the truth, and so did the officer. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "My taillight's out." A simple answer. Honest. But Daniels had been an officer long enough to recognize when there was more to a story. And something about Aaron's eye shunted, exhausted. Pleading told him this was more than just a broken taillight. Daniels nodded, glancing at the taillight. "Yeah, it's out," he confirmed. "How long has it been like that?" Aaron hesitated. He knew this was the part where most people made excuses. "Oh, I didn't notice. I was just about to fix it." But he wasn't going to lie. "A few months," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Months?" Aaron clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't have the money to fix it," he said finally. "Every dollar I make goes to food, rent, my son." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Daniels glanced at the sleeping boy in the back seat, bundled up tightly, his small chest rising and falling with each soft breath. "What's his name?" the officer asked. "Caleb," Aaron replied, his voice filled with something between love and exhaustion. "He's 4. Daniels sighed, looking back at Aaron. He had been on the force for years, long enough to know the difference between someone making excuses and someone just trying to survive. Still, a broken taillight was a broken taillight. He had a job to do. "I'll be right back," Daniels said, walking back to his patrol car. Inside, he ran Aaron's license. No warrants, no prior offenses. Just a man barely scraping by, caught in a system that didn't give second chances. Daniels stared at the screen for a moment, tapping his fingers against the keyboard. Then he made a decision. One that wasn't in the rulebook. He grabbed his ticket pad, scribbled something down, and stepped out of his car. Aaron braced himself as the officer walked back, expecting a fine he only couldn't afford, one that would only push him further into the hole he was already drowning in. But when Daniels handed him the slip of paper, Aaron's breath caught in his throat. Because it wasn't a ticket, it was something else entirely. Aaron stared at the paper in his hands, confused. His eyes darted over the scribbled words, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. It wasn't a citation. It wasn't a fine. It was an address. And a note written in rushed but clear handwriting. "Show up here tomorrow. Ask for Mike. Tell him Officer Daniels sent you." Aaron's eyes flickered up to Daniels, searching for an explanation. "What is this?" he asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. Daniels crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "It's a repair shop. The owner's a friend of mine. He'll fix your taillight no charge." Aaron blinked, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Daniels continued. "I don't know your full situation, Aaron, but I do know that one ticket can sometimes mean the difference between making rent or not, between feeding your kid or not." Aaron's throat tightened. His pride fought against his gratitude, the years of struggle making it hard to accept kindness without suspicion. I don't know what to say," he admitted, shaking his head in disbelief. "You don't have to say anything," Daniels replied. "Just show up." Aaron glanced back at his son, still fast asleep in the back seat, blissfully unaware of the moment unfolding. He inhaled sharply, trying to keep his emotions in check. "You don't have to do this," Aaron said finally. Daniels offered a small, knowing smile. I know. For a long moment, they just stood there. Two men on opposite sides of society, one with a badge, one just trying to get by, but in that moment, there was no divide. Just understanding. Daniels tapped the side of the car lightly. Get home safe, Aaron, and don't forget tomorrow. Aaron nodded, gripping the paper tightly in his hand like it was a lifeline. As Daniels walked back to his patrol car, Aaron sat in silence for a moment, staring at the address. Then, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. But what he didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The next morning, Aaron sat in his car outside the small auto repair shop, gripping the steering wheel. The address was real. The shop was real. But he still wasn't sure if this was. Was this some kind of test? Would they actually help him? Or would they take one look at his situation, his worn-down car, his exhausted face, and turn him away? A little voice from the back seat snapped him out of his thoughts. Daddy, where are we? Aaron turned and met his son's sleepy eyes. Caleb rubbed his tiny fists against his cheeks, blinking against the morning light. Aaron hesitated before answering. Just getting the car fixed, buddy. Caleb yawned, nodding in approval. Good. It makes funny noises. Aaron chuckled under his breath. Yeah, it does. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, Caleb following behind him, clutching his father's hand. The bell above the shop door jingled as they entered. A large man with grease-streaked hands and a worn-out cap glanced up from behind the counter. His name tag read, Mike. You, Aaron? Mike asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Aaron nodded cautiously. Yeah, Officer Daniels sent me. Mike grunted, tossing the rag onto the counter. Figured. He called this morning. He motioned toward the garage. Pull your car in, let's take a look. Aaron hesitated. How much is this gonna… Mike waved a hand, cutting him off. Don't worry about it. Aaron stood frozen for a moment. He wasn't used to things coming without a cost. But when Caleb tugged at his hand, he shook off his hesitation and moved toward the car. Mike's crew got to work immediately. As Aaron stood off to the side, watching, he felt something foreign creeping in, something that had been absent from his life for a long time. Relief. But then Mike called him over. Hey, Aaron. Got a minute? Aaron frowned. Yeah? Mike's expression was unreadable as he wiped his hands again. So, the taillight's an easy fix. But, I gotta ask, when was the last time you had this car fully checked? Aaron swallowed. He knew where this was going. It's been a while. Mike sighed. Your brakes are nearly shot. Tires are worn thin. Batteries barely holding on. This car's holding together by a thread, man. Aaron felt his stomach drop. He barely had enough for groceries some weeks. There was no way he could afford a full repair. I don't. Mike held up a hand. Relax. I already told you not to worry about the cost. Aaron shook his head. I can't let you. Mike leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the counter. Look, man, I don't know your full story, but I know what it's like to struggle. And I know Daniels. He wouldn't send you here unless he knew you needed a break. Aaron exhaled slowly, his emotions threatening to spill over. Then Mike added, So, here's the deal, I got a couple of guys who owe me favors. We'll get this car running safe for you and your boy. No charge. Aaron felt his throat tighten. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Not out of anger, but out of something he couldn't quite describe. Mike clapped a hand on his shoulder. Just promise me one thing. Aaron blinked. Anything. Mike smiled. When you're back on your feet, you do the same for someone else. Aaron let out a shaky breath and nodded. Because for the first time in a long time, he believed he could. Hours passed as the mechanics worked on Aaron's car. He stood to the side, watching as they lifted the hood, replaced parts, and carefully inspected every inch of the vehicle. It didn't feel real. He was used to struggling, used to hearing no more than yes, used to pushing forward even when every door seemed to close in his face. But here he was, watching complete strangers fix his car without asking for a single cent. Caleb sat on a bench nearby, swinging his legs, completely unaware of how much this moment meant to his father. He was focused on the sandwich one of the workers had handed him earlier, happily munching away. Aaron, on the other hand, felt like he was holding his breath. Mike walked over, wiping his hands on his already dirty rag. Almost done, he said, nodding toward the car. We're replacing the brakes now. That should keep you safe for a while. Aaron exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know how to thank you. Mike gave him a look. Did I ask for thanks? Aaron let out a small chuckle. No, but still, I don't get help like this often. Mike leaned against the workbench, studying him for a moment. That's the problem, isn't it? Aaron frowned. What do you mean? Mike sighed. People don't expect kindness anymore. The world's turned so cold that when someone does something decent, it feels like a miracle. Aaron nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly how it feels. Mike smirked. Well, it shouldn't. People just need to look out for each other more. Ain't that what life's about? Aaron thought about that. He thought about all the times he had struggled alone, about all the nights he lay awake, wondering how he was going to make it to the next paycheck. He thought about how one bad break could spiral into something worse, how one small act of kindness could change everything. And today, it had. Just then, one of the mechanics called out, "We're all set, boss." Mike clapped his hands. All right, Aaron, you're good to go. Aaron turned to the car, his heart pounding. It looked the same on the outside, but on the inside, it was a lifeline he hadn't expected but desperately needed. He turned back to Mike. I won't forget this. Mike simply nodded. I know. Aaron looked down at Caleb, who was now licking the last crumbs off his fingers. Come on, buddy. Let's get going. Caleb jumped off the bench, grinning. Does this mean the car won't make weird noises anymore? Aaron laughed, ruffling his son's hair. No more weird noises. As he got into the car, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't just about the repairs, it was about the reminder that good people still existed. That help could come when you least expected it. And as he pulled out of the shop's lot, he silently promised himself one thing when the time came: he would pass this kindness on. Because sometimes, one small act could change everything. Part 6. The road stretched ahead of Aaron, the hum of the newly repaired engine filling the silence. It was the smoothest ride he had in months, maybe even years. He glanced at Caleb through the rearview mirror. The boy was leaning against the window, his eyes struggling to stay open. It had been a long morning, and the warmth of the sun streaming through the glass was lulling him to sleep. Aaron's hands gripped the wheel a little tighter. Everything felt different. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he wasn't driving with the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. No fear of the car breaking down, no anxiety over what he'd do next. Just a quiet, steady ride forward. And it was all because of one man, Officer Daniels. Aaron's stomach twisted as he thought back to that night. The flashing lights, the sinking feeling in his gut. He had been certain it was going to end badly. Another setback. Another problem he didn't have a solution for. But instead, it had been the opposite. A lifeline. And suddenly, he knew he couldn't just let it end here. He needed to find Officer Daniels. Aaron pulled into a gas station, parked the car, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through the missed calls and texts, searching for anything from that night. Then he found it, the number Daniels had given him before he drove away. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he took a deep breath and pressed call. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, "This is Daniels." Aaron swallowed. "Officer, hey, it's Aaron. Aaron Reed." A brief pause. Then, "Aaron, good to hear from you, man. Everything all right?" Aaron let out a breath. "Yeah. More than all right. I needed to call you. To thank you." Daniels chuckled. "You don't have to thank me, Aaron." "No, I do," Aaron insisted. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't pulled me over that night. But because of you, my car is running. My son is safe. And I feel like I can finally breathe again." There was another pause on the other end. Then Daniels spoke, his voice softer this time. "You don't know how much that means to hear." Aaron frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniels exhaled. "You were the last stop on my shift that night. And, to be honest, I was feeling pretty drained. This job isn't easy. You see a lot of things you wish you could fix, but most of the time, you can't. That night, I don't know. I was questioning if I was even making a difference anymore." Aaron's breath caught in his throat. "And then I met you," Daniels continued. "And I could do something. And I knew in that moment that I had to." Aaron's chest tightened. He had spent so much time thinking about how much he had needed help, he hadn't considered that maybe Daniels had needed something too. Reassurance. Proof that what he did mattered. Aaron cleared his throat. "Well, you did. You made a difference. More than you know." Daniels was quiet for a moment, then he let out a chuckle. "Glad to hear it, Aaron." Aaron smiled. "I won't forget it." Daniels replied, "I know you won't." And in that moment, Aaron realized something. Maybe this wasn't just about him. Maybe, in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving, small acts of kindness didn't just help those on the receiving end. Maybe they were a reminder for the givers, too, proof that what they did mattered. And maybe that was how the cycle of goodness kept going. Aaron hung up the phone, staring at the darkened screen for a moment. His heart was still pounding, not from fear or anxiety, but from something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to look at Caleb. His son had finally given in to sleep, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Aaron smiled. There had been nights when he'd laid awake, wondering how much longer he could hold on. Days when he'd felt like he was running on nothing but empty promises and sheer willpower. But this was different. He had a job interview in 2 days. His car was running. And for the first time in forever, the world didn't seem so impossibly heavy. He reached for the ignition and started the car again. The road stretched ahead of him, leading somewhere he couldn't quite see yet, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of where it would take him. And as he pulled out of the gas station, a thought struck him. What if Officer Daniels had ignored his gut that night? What if he had just handed him the ticket and walked away? What if he hadn't cared? The weight of that thought made Aaron grip the steering wheel a little tighter. It was a reminder, and he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness weren't just moments, they were turning points. They were the difference between falling and standing, between giving up and moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, they were what kept the world going. Aaron exhaled, watching the sun rise a little higher in the sky. A new day, a fresh start, and for the first time in a long time, he was ready for it.